National Secretariat of the Latin American Network about stigma and discrimination. But then I thought I'd prefer to really give some more information and data on this issue, and specifically with regards to Mexico. And I'm going to talk specifically about three main elements.
Y la primera cosa es que me gustaría hablar sobre cómo pensamos los mexicanos, las y los mexicanos en este momento sobre las diferentes poblaciones que integramos la sociedad mexicana.
So first of all, I'd like to talk about how do we in Mexico, so Mexican people, women and men, how do we think and feel about the different kinds of groups of populations that are present in Mexican society?
Porque si bien es cierto, el estigma, la discriminación y la criminalización forzosamente tienen un proceso de acción, pero previo a ese proceso de acción hay un proceso en donde la gente piensa sobre la diferencia.
Because when you talk about stigmas and discrimination and criminalization, there is of course an action, but before that specific action there is a whole process of thinking by the people about the differences that they see or that they feel.
Y cuando veo los datos a nivel nacional en México, lo primero que se me viene a la mente es esta dicotomía de quién se coloca en el centro como la norma y quién está hacia afuera en la periferia. ¿Quién coloca a estos sectores vulnerables o tradicionalmente llamados vulnerables en la periferia y quién se coloca en el centro como la única verdad?
So when I look at the different data that we have on national level in Mexico, when we look at this dichotomy about who is in the center traditionally and who is more in the periphery, so what makes it that normally the vulnerable sectors are mostly placed in the periphery, and what is the only truth that makes it other groups are in the center?
Yeah. La primera cosa que diré es que 6 de cada 10 mexicanos piensa que la riqueza mal distribuida es lo que divide a nuestra sociedad mexicana. 4 de cada 10 mexicanos no estaría dispuesto a permitir que en su casa vivieran personas homosexuales y personas que viven con VIH.
Okay, so some data. 6 out of 10 Mexicans, so 60%, they feel that the wealth in Mexico is not equally distributed. And 40% of the Mexicans would not allow gay people and people with HIV to live in their homes.
6 de cada 10 personas piensa que los derechos de homosexuales, lesbianas, indígenas, inmigrantes no se respetan en mi país.
And so 60% of the Mexicans, they feel that the rights of gay and lesbians and migrants and indigenous people are not respected in Mexico.
Poco más de 3 de cada 10 personas jóvenes considera, más bien es excluido por su poca preparación en México.
And a bit more than 30% of the young people in Mexico is excluded from society because they don't have enough education.
3 de cada 10 personas que profesa una religión es discriminada en México.
And 30% of people in Mexico who have some kind of religion is being discriminated.
Aún en estos tiempos, 3 de cada 10 mujeres pide permiso o avisa al marido para poder decidir por quién votar en un proceso electoral. 4 de cada 10 mujeres pide permiso aún al marido para poder usar un anticonceptivo.
Still nowadays, 30% of the women in Mexico they have to ask their husbands for permission to vote during elections. And 40% of those women also still have to ask permission to use some kind of anticonceptive.
3 de cada 10 niños y niñas han declarado que han sido maltratados en México. 6 de cada 10 migrantes consideran que se respetan poco sus derechos en México.
30% of the children in Mexico have been abused, they have suffered some kind of abuse, and 60% of the migrants, they feel that their rights have been violated.
Por primera vez se analiza la percepción que se tiene hacia las mujeres trabajadoras domésticas y ellas sufren abuso, maltrato, humillación y discriminación. Muchas de estas mujeres que se dedican al trabajo doméstico tienen un origen étnico.
For the first time in history, there has been an analysis carried out about the perception of women working at households, right? So doing those kinds of chores, etc. And those kind of women, they have suffered abuse, humiliation, discrimination, etc.
1 de cada 2 personas lesbianas, homosexuales o bisexuales sufre discriminación, falta de aceptación, críticas y burlas.
50% of gay, bisexual have suffered all kinds of people laughing at them, all kinds of criticism, and they feel that they're not accepted.
Finalmente, el principal problema de las comunidades indígenas es la discriminación, efectivamente, la pobreza y el desempleo.
And finally, the main issue that Indigenous people face is discrimination, unemployment, and also lack of wealth, and so they're poor.
Y en realidad, para ir centrándonos con el tema del VIH y su impacto en las comunidades, les quiero proponer que analicemos o que tomemos en cuenta 3 elementos básicos que me parece que no hemos abordado a la hora de pensar la respuesta al VIH.
And finally, to focus a bit more on the impact of HIV on the communities, indigenous communities, I'd like to propose a kind of analysis that includes 3 basic elements that are not really being thought of when we think about a solution for HIV.
La primera cosa tiene que ver con esto que hablábamos el día de ayer sobre la colonización o la herencia de la colonización y que es la cultura que aún las culturas indígenas se les toma como rehén en el marco del estigma y la discriminación y en un marco mucho más histórico, porque parece ser que no terminamos de encajar en muchas sociedades en que hoy vivimos.
So first of all, this is an issue that we talked about yesterday, colonization, so the heritage that is imposed on us. Basically, it's a specific culture, so within this framework of stigma and discrimination, and it is a historical framework. It seems that we live in a society where we as a group do not really fit in.
El segundo elemento es el cuerpo indígena como el sujeto a controlar. Hay 2 supuestos en el cuerpo indígena. Uno que es heterosexual, que no existe la diversidad sexual. Y el otro supuesto es una cuestión naturalista, que es como si nuestros cuerpos más bien como si nuestros cuerpos fueran inalterables, como si no se pudieran infectar de VIH. Y eso atraviesa en no reconocer que somos sujetos de deseo, de placer y de posibles infecciones.
Secondly, it's about our body, the indigenous body, so that is a subject that can be controlled. So on the one hand side, you have the heterosexuals, so where there seems to be no sexual diversity. And on the other hand, you have like this naturalist thing where our body cannot change, so it cannot be infected with HIV, so it's not changing. And of course, we are subject to change of pleasure and infection, and everything can be changed.
Finalmente, en términos de política pública o de políticas, muchas veces el Estado, las agencias de cooperación, no nos terminan de ver como contrapartes. Muchas veces ven que nuestra organización indígena es un riesgo hacia ese discurso hegemónico.
And thirdly, it's about the public policies or policies in general. It seems to be that the different states and cooperation agencies, they do not really see us as counterparts they can dialogue with. So they consider us more to be some kind of risk. So it's not really part of the discourse, of the hegemony.
La pregunta en todo caso es, ¿dónde queremos colocarnos frente al estigma, la discriminación y la colonización? Mi propuesta es que ninguna lucha la podemos hacer solos. Hay otras poblaciones con las que tenemos que aliarnos, como son las mujeres, las personas con discapacidad, los migrantes, las trabajadoras domésticas, los afrodescendientes, los ambientalistas, los animalistas, muchísimos otros movimientos que también son excluidos de esa hegemonía.
So the question arises, where are we at? So where are we with regards to this fight against stigma, colonization, discrimination? The thing is, we don't have to fight alone. So we can ally ourselves with other people, other groups, like for instance, to mention one of the whole list that Amaranta mentioned. So you have the women, you have Afro-descendants, you have people that work on the environment, domestic workers, people with some kind of ethnicity.
Es decir que la gran oportunidad que yo creo para combatir el estigma y la discriminación es pensar en hacer luchas interseccionales en el futuro. Solos y solas va a ser muy complicado revertir el impacto que tiene el estigma y la discriminación. Muchas gracias.
So I think that our big opportunity is to really fight against stigma and discrimination, is to do it with the different groups, like in an intersectional way. So we can't do it alone, it's impossible, but I think that if we are able to form this kind of alliances, we'll be able to at least diminish the impact that stigma and discrimination has. Thank you very much.
Thank you. One of the lists, the words that came out to me that I asked was the ambientalista. Environmentalist, that's the one that I was looking to. Anyway, thank you very much for that lovely presentation and the good translation. I appreciate seeing the slides as well. So next I am going to call up Sean, who's going to do a presentation for us as well, and I believe he will be my future mentor. Welcome, Sean.
Excellent. So, good morning, everyone. I'm going to present very quickly in 10 minutes. I have 20 slides. An overview of my dissertation research and the major themes around discrimination, stigma, and criminalization that came out of that. So I would note, because I'm required to by our funder, that this research was funded by the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. So I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. So I start by acknowledging the many nations on Turtle Island who made this research possible. This research focused substantially in the GTA, but across all of Northern Ontario. And so I recognize the Mississaugas of the New Credit First Nation, the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mohawks, and Métis Nations. I had papers and I forgot them in my Airbnb, so we're gonna kind of read this off together. So what this project started out as was looking at policy. So I wanted to see in Canada, what has the government put in place in terms of policy to... Still reading it? Absolutely. No problem. So this research looked to examine the policies that are in place in Canada to actually direct funding for HIV services, prevention care, treatment to Indigenous people living on reserves in the province of Ontario in Canada. And so I did a policy review. After that, we found there is no policy in Canada that actually dictates that there is to be a dedicated funding envelope for HIV services, prevention, treatment, or how that's to be actually dispersed from the federal government. And so what that led me to go down was interviews. And so I did storytelling interviews with 29 individuals. It took 20 months to recruit and conduct these interviews, and we did this across 6 urban centers. So very quick overview, I'm not going to go through this, but this is what the demographics in Canada and the province of Ontario currently look like. We have very little data on what the incidence of HIV amongst Indigenous people in Ontario looks like. That's because of how the province for the past 3 decades has tracked HIV incidence, and they haven't looked at ethnicity until quite recently. So this research was community engaged and based in nature. I didn't come up with this research question myself. I worked with 2 organizations, the Ontario Aboriginal HIV/AIDS Strategy and Two-Spirit People of the First Nation. They co-created and developed this research in totality with Tony Novus and Art Zuckel, and the dissertation is dedicated in the name of Tony, who passed to Spirit World 2 years ago. And so this research was approved by our REB. And in order to participate, you had to be at least 16 years of age, you had to have been diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, and you had to have come from a First Nation reserve in Ontario, which meant that you had to have status. So this is the federal government's recognition of being Indigenous or First Nation in Canada. I'm not going to go through this. I know a lot of texts don't try to read it because to give you policy. But this is the colonial policy that underpins healthcare in Canada. Absolutely everything that comes in terms of Indigenous healthcare in Canada is steeped in colonial policy, dating back from the Royal Proclamation in 1763 down to Indian Health Transfer Policies, the Canada Health Act, and the Constitution Act. All of these various policies state how Indigenous people are to receive care, where they receive care, and it's a very complicated system because people living on First Nation reserves in Canada fall under the jurisdiction of the federal government, whereas healthcare is the purview of the provincial government. And so we have this conflict of the federal government providing healthcare in remote and reserved communities, and they don't do it well. And they don't partner well with the provinces in trying to deliver that care. And so we see substantial gaps in how we access care. And so when we look at HIV policy specifically, there is no HIV-related policy in Canada, and especially when it comes to funding. And so I contend that a lack of policy, which we would call soft policy, is the conscious decision of policymakers in Canada. So when the Canadian government chooses to not make a policy or not to do something, I would contend that that in and of itself is a policy. And they do this, in my contention, in order to pass off jurisdictional responsibility, because they don't want to commit themselves to paying for healthcare in the long run. And so, perfect. Now I can look down here. So this very conscious decision, I can see I have a spelling mistake, is a form of policy in and of itself. And so we look at how this continues to colonize Indigenous people within Canada, and that through this very conscious decision, the Canadian government continues to ensure that people cannot access care, services, and treatment that they require in order to survive within our country. So through this research, we looked at storytelling. So we did storytelling with 29 participants. We then transcribed those stories. We coded them for major themes. We found over 150 different common nodes throughout the research that made up 17 themes. And we also used freedom of information requests to the federal government to try and access some of the funding data. And so what we found is that the government substantially underfunds HIV services in the province of Ontario and across the country. And this was the question I posed to the Chief Medical Officer yesterday. And so what you can see, this is funding for HIV prevention, education, treatment, services, programming in the entire province of Ontario. The province comprises of 126 individual grants, and the federal government is currently paying less than $1 million in healthcare for all of those communities, which works out to about, what do we have here, about $3,000 per community, if you wanted to look at that. So substantially underfunded. And so what we did with this is we then said there's a clear lack of funding, and so we went to individuals living with HIV who were living in these communities and had to leave their communities in order to access care and treatment, and asked them what their experiences were. And so this is basically what I just said. So what we found is very similar to what is in the literature. And that funding produces an environment. When you have a lack of funding, you clearly will then have a lack of testing, a lack of treatment, and a lack of services. And this is present across First Nations communities in Ontario. So when we broke down the participant data, we had 29 participants. Very interesting is that the majority of the participants were straight, and straight males and females. And we had, and so they made up 22% of that cohort. Older in age, 48 was the average age, and then the average income was just $1,300 Canadian, and all of the participants were on disability support programming. And so these are the results specific to the panel that we're looking at today. And so all 29 participants discussed issues with accessing care in their communities. And so 24 specifically talked about access to care not being available in their communities. And then if we look down, if we look at the number 19, so on the right, so there are no services in their reserves whatsoever. And so this forced people to leave their communities in order to actually access care. When we look at discrimination, and one of the other big things that came out was around culture, and that there was virtually zero access to any cultural services for Indigenous people living with HIV/AIDS that they felt that they could access. And that was fairly substantial. 25 participants talked about discrimination, and many of them talked about it in the context of accessing healthcare, that they were limited in being able to access proper doctors, or that their doctors, made racist comments and those types of things toward them as they were accessing care. 25 participants specifically talked about stigma they faced in their communities and outside their communities, and 4 of that led to violent stigma. So they were actually assaulted. One person was almost killed when the community found out that they were HIV positive. Homophobia played in with 3 of those participants. Racism, so 9 participants specifically talked about racism that they faced in trying to access the healthcare system. And all of this, so we lumped this into discrimination, and the outcome was that 6 people had contemplated suicide and wanting to die. And so that's fairly significant in such a small number of just 29 participants. 9 people discussed criminalization of their HIV status, and some of this revolved around not knowing what their rights were or what they were required under Canadian law to actually disclose. And seven participants had said that they had failed to disclose their HIV status, which led to issues with the law. And that 4 people were directly incarcerated as a result of their HIV status in this research. So fairly substantial number And I want to tie this all together with participants talking about how life has been hard for them. So we're not going to go through, because I only have a minute left, we're not going to go through these stories, but if you're interested, this is what some of this looks like. We've taken little bits of people's stories, and we're publishing the stories in a whole, hopefully in a book very soon, to actually give voice to Indigenous people living with HIV and how their life has been impacted by a lack of funding and the colonization of Canada. And so this story talks about stigma. So 25 participants across 67 different instances of stigma that they experienced. Criminalization. And so this person is just talking about their lack of knowledge around criminalization in Canada and how they were scared to just go to a dentist because of their requirement to disclose their status in Canada and what that meant for them and why they didn't access a dentist for so long. And then a story here of how life has been hard. And this was something that I found interesting that came out of the research, and there are lots of interesting stories connected to this. And so very quickly, what I want to highlight here is really the discussion. And this lack of funding or this lack of policy in the area of Indigenous HIV, creates all kinds of ripple down effects that lead to a lack of education in communities. And when you have a lack of education in communities, you get stigma and discrimination that are attached to it. And that's substantially what participants asked for in recommendations was, we want more education, we want more funding for education in our communities so we can better our communities' knowledge so we can return home again. A lack of funding has a clear connection with the ability to access testing, treatment, care services, programming. This isn't rocket science to anybody, but there's no data and there's no peer-reviewed research that actually talks about this. And so this is why Tony and Art said we needed to do this research. And so this is the third bullet point here, is something that I recently just added. And so my argument, my question yesterday to the Chief Medical Officer of Health was that the Canadian government, year over year for the past 3 years, has decreased HIV funding in Canada by 4%, while we see incidents of HIV in Indigenous populations continuing to increase. And he responded back by saying the Canadian government has just recommitted $37.5 million over 5 years to HIV in Indigenous communities. And I say that this is a continued act of colonization. You cannot continue to withdraw money year over year and then say, look at us, we're so great, we're giving you money now to continue the fight against HIV. You can't recommit money and give money back to communities and pretend like you're the good person in all of this, right? It's this idea that we must have gratitude towards the Canadian government for all the good things that they do when they really continue this process of colonization. And that education and prevention must be at the cornerstone and be a priority in order to reduce stigma within our communities. So there were 29 participant recommendations, which I'm not going to go through, many of them directed towards various levels of government, the federal government, provincial government, Indigenous communities and political organizations, non-Indigenous HIV/AIDS organizations, and Indigenous HIV organizations. And participants talked very directly in a number of cases about Indigenous people living with HIV, and so there's a recommendation there for people living with HIV. So we need to better track HIV in the province of Ontario so we can actually determine what funding needs to be properly put in place. We need funding increases that are dedicated and permanent in nature, right? We can't continue to get 5-year allotments of funding and say that we're going to eradicate HIV in communities. We must develop a comprehensive HIV education program that is led by and geared towards Indigenous people living with HIV in order to combat the issue in our northern communities. Thank you. I went over time, I apologize.
Thank you. So I think it's just a point that I take away from there, and I'm not sure the best way to say it. Often when we talk about determinants of health for Indigenous peoples, we speak about income or the economies or poverty. And I think that particular way of looking at it needs to be applied to the organizational and policy spaces as well. So now I'm going to invite up Sheldon. And Sheldon has been quite active in our entryway. Is that right, Sheldon? Putting together the PrEPahHontoz TV. So I would like you to welcome Sheldon, and he will present on stigma discrimination and criminalization.
Thank you.
Welcome, Sheldon.
Sheldon Machiapielo. Good morning. My name is Sheldon Raymore. I'm from the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe in South Dakota, USA. And in the Lakota Sioux language, the words Wanietu Wawapi translate to winter count. Winter count images marked a notable occurrence among the Sioux people as a timeline of significant year-end events. These collections of winter count catalogs, traditionally etched, painted, and/or drawn on buffalo hides, later muslin fabric, are a pictorial accounting of the past year's happenings, ultimately serving as a traditional history book. With tradition as prevention as a core value of the TP project, it is this traditional way of preserving information for generations to come that is being revised and reclaimed as we continue to battle HIV/AIDS epidemic in Native communities. So what you see out in the entryway was the teepee. And the teepee symbolizes home, it symbolizes community, it symbolizes family. And so it was important to utilize the teepee, but the other component was adding the winter count onto it. Art as prevention. When I look at this symbol up here for what that represents, when I see this symbol, I look at the 4 colors, right? And those 4 colors in our creation story say that those were the original root races of man that were created. And so each of those colors represents the people of this world. And so so when you look at symbols and characters in art, it's really powerful because it'll communicate in ways that words can't. And so that's why it was important for us to use this TP project as a way of educating community members about HIV/AIDS, the history, and all the work that's come throughout the last 30-some years. And language has been very important, language revitalization. There's a count on the TV that says Shikshio and in Lakota that means to die of a venereal disease. And that was taken from the Lakota Language Consortium app. And that's the language that they're using to describe, there's no word for HIV, but there's a word for AIDS. And it doesn't speak to anything about an autoimmune disease at all. And so it's really important when we are creating these words, these new words in our indigenous languages, that we're trauma informed and that we're not creating more stigmas on top of them. And so I keep that as a teaching tool, and that's why I put it on that teepee, so I can explain that to people that, as we go throughout Indian country, I ask different nations, what is their word for HIV or AIDS? And they share their different words and their different stories and why they came up with that word for it. So understanding that us as Indigenous people, we have many different ways of communicating, right? Long time ago, they used to do the hand signs. So for medicine was a hand symbol like that. So it's really taking our Indigenous voices and our Indigenous ways of communicating and applying those in unique and innovative ways that can speak to our peoples. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. But I'll be up here at the panel if you all have any questions and want to ask any about the TP project. Unfortunately, I have to go and disassemble it, and it'll be set up at the youth headquarters, the HQ headquarters. So that's where I'll be right after this presentation. So thank you so much for inviting me here and to be a part of this. It's big. That's such a wonderful opportunity, and it's been an honor. And I'd like to thank each and every one of you in this room for doing the work that you're doing and continuing. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheldon. And so our final presentation comes from Cecile. If you would come up and share with us, that would be wonderful.
Yes, Cecile.
Hi. Look, I'm much smaller. Hi everyone, my name is Cecile Kazatchkine. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Canadian HIV/AIDS Legal Network. We are an organization that promotes and defends the rights of people living with HIV and who are affected by HIV, and work in Canada and internationally. And I'd like to say that we are very honored to be invited to this conference, and I really want to thank you for this opportunity. I also want to acknowledge the continuous injustice against Indigenous people in Canada. And I want to say that the Legal Network is committed to continue to work with our Indigenous colleagues to fight those abuse. And so thank you again for having us. So I have some slides. I don't know if we could put them up. That would be great. But I can start anyway. So today I'm going to talk about the criminalization of HIV. And this is something that's already been mentioned in the presentation. And first, maybe I should say that I'm going to focus on Canada, but this is a global phenomenon. And it's the fact that people living with HIV are being criminalized. So the criminal law is being used against people living with HIV based on their status. Canada, and this is a phenomenon that also exists in Mexico, for example. But Canada is really one of the leaders in terms of prosecuting people living with HIV. We are in the top 5 countries in terms of number of prosecution against people living with HIV. And I think it's very valid for a panel on discrimination to talk about criminalization, because this is one of the most pervasive systemic discrimination against people living with HIV. Okay. It doesn't.
Right. Your point here. Up there.
That? No.
Get that.
2 arrows, right is next one.
Wait. That's what I'm pressing. Sorry about that. Well, should I just continue maybe? Yeah? Okay. So HIV criminalization in Canada is the fact that someone living with HIV can be prosecuted for not disclosing their status before having sex. There is no specific law in the book in Canada that criminalizes HIV or that obliges people to disclose their status before sex. We're using the law of sexual assault, which is one of the most serious criminal offenses in our criminal code. And it does work now? Thank you so much. Sorry about that. To show you how serious the issue is, there have been around 200 people that we know of that have been charged in Canada for not disclosing their status to sexual partners. The criminalization in Canada is very severe. People can be prosecuted even if they had no intent to harm their partner, even if HIV was not transmitted, and even if actually they didn't pose a significant risk of transmission, or the risk of transmission was extremely low, or even maybe there was no risk of transmission. And this is because medical evidence are not really taken into account by the court. And this is a result of a Supreme Court decision back in 2012 that suggested that you must disclose your status unless you use a condom and you have an undetectable viral load. Things have evolved since then, but the Supreme Court decision in 2012 has been very problematic and has resulted in prosecution against people living with HIV, even if they used a condom or even if they had an undetectable viral load. And we know that in those circumstances, the risk of transmission is basically zero. So we are very concerned about HIV criminalization because it's at odds with medical evidence. The courts have really a lot of difficulty understanding the science behind HIV, the impact of treatment, the impact of condom, because we have all these stereotypes and fear around HIV, and unfortunately, it's still driving some of the prosecution. The law around criminalization also doesn't take into account, the complexity of HIV non-disclosure and why it's very difficult to disclose your status and the consequences that go with HIV disclosure. And it's just using a very blunt instrument to deal with something that is extremely complex. HIV criminalization in Canada is very concerning because it has disproportionate impact on communities that do not have equal access to treatment, and we mentioned this before in previous presentations, and that cannot achieve a low viral load. And if, being under treatment, having an undetectable viral load could be considered as a valid defense, that might not be a defense available to communities that do not have access to treatment. And we are seeing that also HIV criminalization has a disproportionate impact on communities, especially women living with HIV, who are not in a position to disclose their status safely or to impose precaution like condom use. In terms of the impact of HIV criminalization in Indigenous communities, of course, it has a disproportionate impact because Indigenous communities are disproportionately impacted by HIV in Canada. In terms of statistics, it's very hard to actually know how many people who were charged identify as Indigenous because information is very limited. Actually, it's the legal network tracking cases right now in Canada, and we just do that through media report and what we hear, so our data is limited. But we can say that at least 6% of people who've been charged identify as Indigenous, but it might be more. And in terms of the impact on women living with HIV, there you can see a really disproportionate impact on Indigenous communities. Of the 18 women who have been criminalized in Canada for non-disclosure, we know of at the race ethnicity of at least 12 women, and 5 of them are Indigenous, and I believe it might be more. So this is very, very concerning. And with regard to the actual impact beyond statistics, I would like to point out that I've heard that there is a new study that's been done in Regina in Saskatchewan with interview of 26 individuals who identify as Indigenous and who talk about the impact of HIV criminalization and the fear that it creates, the fear of going to prison, the negative impact it has on relationship, how it exacerbates violence against women, the fear of being further discriminated by police and being targeted for both living with HIV and being Indigenous. So I would recommend that you actually look at that study to think about the impact on Indigenous communities. But I'm just going to go back to what I know, and it's the story of a woman who've been criminalized. That was pretty recent and happened in Manitoba, and I followed that case very closely. I've been trying to, at the Legal Network, we try to support lawyers who represent people living with HIV as much as we can. And I've also been working very closely with Laven Gervais, who is a support worker and who's been working a lot and providing a lot of support to these women. But this story is very disheartening, and for me it's just a pure illustration of why it's wrong, what's going on in Canada. So in March 2016, 29 years old Indigenous woman was sentenced to 2 years in jail for aggravated sexual assault. What did she do 4 years ago? She had sex 3 times with another man, with a man. They didn't use a condom, and she didn't disclose her status. She didn't disclose her status because she was scared of being rejected, and she was also in denial. It was just a lot of different things happening, and that's something that the judge actually acknowledged, but still, she was convicted, and she was sent to jail. Very troubling is that these women, as many women living with HIV who have been criminalized for non-disclosure, is a survivor of sexual violence. She never got justice for what she experienced, but the justice system came after her, and now she's designated as a sexual offender, because in Canada we use the law of sexual assault to prosecute people who do not disclose their status. So you can see the very troubling, problematic association of people living with HIV being criminal and sexual offender for non-disclosure, even in the context of consensual sex. It's really bizarre. This woman had no defense because she didn't use a condom, and she was not on treatment, so she didn't have an undetectable viral load at the time. So she was convicted, and she was sent to jail. Her appeal was dismissed, and so she's now in jail. And it's very sad because she was actually, all this happened when her life was actually getting back on the right track, and the justice just came to squash all these efforts. But to finish on a more positive note, I'd like to acknowledge that a lot of things are going on in Canada to respond to current use of the criminal law. So there are different initiatives. For example, we developed with CAN resources on HIV non-disclosure and criminalization for people to have information about their rights. There are studies happening. I would like to mention the WATCH study. Through body mapping, people are looking at the impact of HIV criminalization on women, including Indigenous women. And also there is now a national coalition to end HIV criminalization, to reform HIV criminalization in Canada. And it does include IIWGHA, who worked with us on the Manitoba case, and who's wonderful, and as well as Valérie Nicholson, that I also want to congratulate today. And we have been making progress. There is definitely less cases now in Canada against people living with HIV, less criminalization case. And I think there is a recognition, growing recognition, that at least scientific evidence around viral load and the impact of treatment should be taken into account by the courts, by the Crown prosecutors. So we are seeing some progresses, but of course this is not sufficient. We're also not going to solve HIV criminalization through science alone. And in fact, international recommendations say that criminalization should be strictly limited to cases that are extremely rare, where someone has an intention to transmit and actually transmit HIV, and that's not what we see in Canada. So a lot of more efforts are to be done, and I hope that we can continue to work together toward that. Thank you so much for your attention.
If you would, can I have the people that presented just come and take a seat up there? And if I can get someone to take the microphone. We only have about 10 minutes for question and answer period. So if you have them, let's go. Is there questions remaining? And then the response, I suppose, run to the microphone if you could.
losing my voice, so that's why my voice sounds so deep. I just want to say thanks to all the presenters. I just wanted to say to Sean, I took part in Sean's research, and it was a pleasure to be able to get my story out there, but a lot of my work is done in Indigenous communities in Ontario, and it was really great to be able to have that opportunity to get those numbers out and help our leadership become more aware of the need for education around stigma and discrimination in First Nations in Ontario, because a lot of our Indigenous leaders in Ontario are HIV at the very bottom of their list of priorities. And each time that I go to present to the Chiefs of Ontario, I usually get bumped off the agenda. I've been able to present to them finally last year, and they didn't even know what treatment as prevention was. So they wanted more information on that. So fortunately, this year, we actually have a new Ontario Regional Chief, and she's a woman for the first time in history. So it's really exciting for HIV because she actually has some background and she's supportive of those initiatives. So I'm hopeful to see some change happen in the coming years. So I just have to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to be part of the research.
Hello there, I'm Trevor, and I want to talk about the U=U campaign, which is undetectable equals untransmittable or untransmissible. And this is a campaign that was developed by people living with HIV to let the world know that according to science, if you can get on treatment and get your viral load to undetectable levels, that it is impossible to pass HIV sexually to your partner. And I was never told that. I've been living with HIV for 28 years, and no doctor ever told me that. They knew that for a long time. And so now, the U=U campaign has really liberated a lot of us who didn't know that and thought of ourselves as vectors of disease, when all this time we could not have transmitted HIV if we're undetectable. So it's nice to see this mainstream movement of U=U, and it's translated into all these other countries. But my question is, in Indigenous country, how relevant is U=U? Is this something that we can embrace when many people, for example, living with HIV and hepatitis C don't understand the differences between the disease, the viral loads, the treatment, the access to treatment? And I'd like to ask all of the panelists, like, what's it like in Mexico? Has it reached there? And how is it being taken up by Indigenous? In the US, in your study, in Toronto, did you hear about that? And from the legal perspective, is this something that helps the legal response? So it's really a question to all the panelists.
Did someone want to respond to Trevor? Yeah, if you get up to the microphone.
I can start.
Or I can bring this up.
Yeah.
Okay, so I will respond to your last question about the legal response. It is a very important tool in terms of the legal response to prevent prosecution that are just based on prejudice and fear, and continue to prosecute people who don't even pose a risk of prosecution. So it's very important, and I'd like to acknowledge that in Canada, some scientists have actually mobilized, and in 2014, they released a statement that touches on viral load and the impact of condom and risk. And the purpose was to inform judges and lawyers about the risk of transmission, to try to disconstruct all these misconceptions. And stay tuned, because at the conference on Wednesday, another important document will come out to also try to bring some science to justice. But I think that you're pointing a very important element, Trevor, and it's about how, this you also can create some discrimination among people living with HIV, and some being seen as infectious, other being seen as infectious, and then where do we draw the line in terms of criminalizing people living with HIV? Are we going to make a difference between people living with HIV who have an undetectable virus, who are not criminals, but the other ones are criminals? And I think that we have to be very careful about this, and this is the limits of the scientific arguments. And this is why it's very important to bring back other human rights considerations when looking at the impact when looking at the issue of criminalization. And this is also why I picked the case of this woman in Manitoba, because she had no scientific defense based on science, but her case was clearly in injustice and needs to be come back.
So very quickly, so this is an interesting connection. So in Indigenous communities, especially in the North in my research study, most participants struggled to be adherent to their medication. We're looking at lots of varying issues of Hep C, lack of access to basic care, follow-up, getting access to their prescriptions. Many participants said that they, due to a lack of transportation, a lack of, missing a doctor's appointment, having to wait another 4 months to see a specialist, that they, many were on and off various drugs at many different points. And so to even think of U equals U in a context of where people are lacking basic access to their prescriptions, is difficult. And so I think it's, bringing that to the North would be great in Canada, but then I think a lot of participants would say, it's difficult just to be adherent, let alone getting to a suppressed viral load.
Yo diría que... ¿Es pasante? Okay. Sí, gracias. Yo diría que justo ese debate está en México ahora, y hay nuevamente este escenario dicotómico de quién sí tiene acceso a eso, a este tipo de estrategias oportunas, entre comillas, si vive en una ciudad, pero si vive en una comunidad es difícil porque el acceso al tratamiento no es tan rápido. Pero tengo la percepción que en general las comunidades indígenas llegamos tarde al acceso.
¿Sigue?
Okay. Llegamos tarde al acceso en el sentido de que muchas comunidades indígenas no conocen su estado serológico. Cuando ya se está hablando aquí del tratamiento de no transmitir en cuanto tengas una carga viral mucho más indetectable, ¿no? Entonces, me parece que a veces es dispar las oportunidades que tiene una comunidad indígena a una comunidad no indígena.
I'd say that this is a very actual debate right now in Mexico. So when we go back to what I said before, this dichotomy about who has access and who doesn't. And access, I mean, with this kind of opportunities to access a hospital. So if you're in a city, yes, you do have, it's easy to get better transport. If you are in more rural areas, then it's really hard. I'd say that in general, the indigenous communities, they came a bit late to all this process of accessing this kind of services. So I mean that in the indigenous communities, even people themselves, they don't really know what their HIV status is. So what their viral load is, if it is transmittable, if it's not transmittable. And so that's really a big issue, this unknown about this viral load.
I don't know if any of you saw this symbol on the teepee, but that represents 2017, which is when U equals U, the campaign was started. And so in my presentations, what I do is I do bring attention to that. It's important. And currently working on some artwork that will have U equals U, but native specific. So it's happening, it's in the works. And so just That's great. Thank you.
So we have time for one more question.
Thank you for your wonderful presentation. They are very insightful and useful for me. I have lots of questions and comments, but since we don't have time, I will limit them. I would like to know from Amaranta if also the UN agencies in Mexico are among those who don't want to deal with indigenous people. Because now there is as I presented yesterday, the system-wide action plan. It's a tool that has been adopted by the UN General Assembly, and the different agencies in countries are committed to work with indigenous people. So it's an international document. Now to Sin, I would like to know if, because there is no allocated funding for HIV, is there for other communicable diseases like STD or blood transmitted diseases, for example, hepatitis, or if we go to other communicable diseases, tuberculosis, is there a specific funding for these? If you get the opportunity through your review of literature to see some findings about that. And finally, I would like to inform you that the next year will be the International Year of Indigenous Languages. So it will be a big opportunity that we have to take for advertising and also inform and communicate as Sheldon thought about that, our ways of communication, our ways of sensitization about the HIV and AIDS. Thank you.
We're at time.
This is we're at the time, so this is the response.
Trevor es un... nos trae cortos con el tiempo. No, Miriam, sí, hay colaboración con instancias de Naciones Unidas en acompañar algunos asuntos de políticas públicas. Sin embargo, dos aspectos que todavía México no ha ratificado es el convenio 161. Como tú dices, el próximo año es un año bastante prometedor. Qué bueno que vamos a tener el año de las lenguas. Y el próximo año México cambia de presidente de la República. Y entonces hay un compromiso del nuevo gobierno que acaba de ganar la izquierda en México, que se va a ratificar el convenio 169. Si ese convenio se firma, se ratifica, habrá muchas otras oportunidades para las comunidades indígenas, incluyendo en la Comisión de la OEA, de Estados Americanos, la Organización de Estados Americanos. Solamente Costa Rica ha ratificado la Convención contra el Racismo y toda clase de discriminación. México está por ratificarlo, y yo creo que para enero o febrero del próximo año tendremos. Si estas dos cosas avanzan, México podrá ofrecer mayores oportunidades, no solamente a las comunidades indígenas, incluyendo a las comunidades afrodescendientes que no están incluidas en la Constitución aún. Es decir, en México no reconocemos como ciudadanos todavía a las personas afrodescendientes.
Okay, so Trevor was keeping us short, but it's taking more time. Okay, so in Mexico there is collaboration with several UN agencies, and it's specifically about public policies. There are two aspects which are not ratified in Mexico of this Covenant 169, but we have hope, like you were saying, it's going to be next year the year of the indigenous languages. That might be positive, and also there are going to be presidential elections in Mexico. That's for 2020. But now we have a leftist government who supposedly is going to ratify 169. So this could be very positive in Mexico, and specifically for the indigenous communities. And also we have the Organization of American States, which also could play a part. Only Costa Rica has ratified the Convention on Discrimination. But I think that Mexico is going to be able to ratify next year, in February or March. And also very important is that the Afro-descendants, for the first time, are going to be included if everything goes well, which is very important since nowadays people from Afro-descendants is not being considered a Mexican citizen.
Very quickly, in terms of funding envelopes, so Canada doesn't have any permanent funding envelopes when it comes to any STDI, so sexually transmitted bloodborne infections. It's really a piecemeal of outbreaks take place, and the government chooses to place money to respond to that. And typically what we see is that First Nations and Inuit Health Branch, which is the sub-department responsible for Indigenous health, will typically take money out of other funding envelopes to place it there. And so there is no permanent funding envelope, and this is one of the issues we see, is that when communities start to do well in areas, so they, they get things under control, they lose funding, and it goes to communities that are in more urgent need. So this is why there's this important pressure to get a permanent, ongoing funding envelope in these areas if you're really looking to eradicate. Thank you.
So we had one hand up, and again, I'm just going to ask you to be very brief with your point, and then, or your question, that it's directed to the legal network. Forgive me.
Hi. I'd just like to thank you for coming to have these conversations with us. So I work mostly with the LGBT and Indigenous youth populations, and so these are really hard conversations to have with young people. And one question I have is in the partner projects that happen, the studies where one partner is undetectable and the other partner is negative. So they follow these zero-discordant relationships and they record X amount of condomless sex acts, and they find that there's zero transmission happening. The only time that transmission has happened is through infidelity. And I'm just wondering, is the way that they prove this because of the different strains of HIV? So because the HIV is running through my DNA, it's like I put my own identifiable footprint, if you will, on my strain of HIV. So let's say that there is a young person who is sexually active, who's had multiple partners, and they have identified one person that they think that they have contracted it from, try and get them convicted, or I've seen a lot of people where HIV was used against them and taken to the court of law. And this has happened quite often in the region that I'm living in as well. So what I'm wondering is, does the court of law take this into consideration, and do they actually investigate like the DNA and the certain strain, and if it's actually coming from the source that's being accused?
And what does the judge and the court of law take into consideration when they're investigating these things?
Thank you. Very good question. Very complex. Are you from Canada?
Yes.
Okay. So in Canada, you actually don't need to have transmitted HIV to be prosecuted. The crime is about non-disclosure. So whether you transmitted HIV is not something that needs to be proved in court. It might be taken into consideration when they look at sentencing. But because it doesn't need to be proved for the crime to be actually met, on non-disclosure is sufficient. And a risk of transmission, but the medical evidence is not necessarily being taken into account. They are not actually investigating closely whether transmission occurs between the accused and the complainant. But I would just like to add that even if it did, it's very difficult to prove that someone transmitted HIV to another person, and it's not like DNA, and it's the phylogenetic evidence that can be used in courts cannot actually prove conclusively that someone transmitted HIV to another person. What they can do is disprove that the person was the source of infection by showing that actually the strain of the virus are incompatible. But it's impossible to prove an exact match is not possible to be established through facts only. So they will have to take other considerations into account. And again, I just want to reiterate that that something, a scientific statement is coming up at the AIDS conference, and it doesn't only touch on evidence regarding the risk of transmission, but also proof of transmission to make sure that there is no misunderstanding of what science can prove or not.
Are you going to do your round for a little while?
Yes, and I'm happy to leave now that I'll be at the conference.
So, yeah, I think it would be great if you do have questions that you speak to the presenters one-on-one on the break, which we're supposed to go into right now. I'm going to ask that that we get our gifters to come up and give you a token of our appreciation and a round of applause, please, for the presentation. Thank you, and we will take our break and be back in, I would say, 15 minutes. And Trevor has given me the okay to